In 1998, the success of the original Resident Evil and the director's cut that followed it was succeeded by Resident Evil 2. A little over a year later, Resident Evil 2 had sold over 1 million more units than its predecessor and is considered by many fans to be the best of the original trilogy. Not all of them, but a good amount. While it was a little less believable that a police station would be set up with all the tricks and traps the same way an evil corporate mansion was, I think Resident Evil 2 took all the right steps to make a great sequel. Starting off with the anthology approach the sequel took with telling a story of a new character in Raccoon City with Leon S. Kennedy, the rookie cop whose first day on the force is the day of the virus outbreak. Along with a small but interesting cast of characters, including future cast members Ada Wong and Claire Redfield. Regardless of the fact that the scope was widened with Resident Evil 2, it still had that tight claustrophobic feel that brought the intensity of the first Resident Evil while doing a good job expanding the world the series takes place in and upping the writing just a little bit, at least in my opinion. So given that Resident Evil was a series that showed how a remake should be done, it was only a matter of time in this remake happy age that we should get a remake of Resident Evil 2. Released about 4 years after it was announced, the RE2 make launched in 2019 and became the third best-selling Capcom game of all time. It's extremely hard for me to wrap my brain around the idea that Resident Evil 2 Remake actually outsold Mega Man X7, but I guess the facts don't lie. This meant that I was basically obligated to talk about the RE2 make, and in all honesty, I've kind of been stalling on it. Not because the game is bad or that I don't appreciate the experience, it's just that it's anxiety-inducing for me. Personally, I find this one a little odd considering I don't have the same problem with games like Outlast, but there's something about the Resident Evil 2 Remake that unnerves me enough that I find excuses to get out of reviewing it. I never actually completed the game before I sat down to do this review, and I only made it as far as getting out of the police station over at a buddy's house, and surprisingly enough, it turns out that it's really hard to focus on solving problems and, learning your environment when there's an unstoppable death machine that follows you literally everywhere you go. I'm definitely one of those weenies that spent more time in the safe room than was necessary because I couldn't tell by the footsteps where the tyrant was. As far as gameplay goes, this is the third-person Resident Evil formula with the UI of Resident Evil 7. I do really like this because Resident Evil 7's UI was a perfect combination of traditional Resident Evil storage system with Resident Evil 4's suitcase system. Also, if you explore the police station to completion the same way my doctor does with my prostate, then you'll have a widely extended pouch that'll be pretty hard to fill if you stop by a chest every so often. Standard difficulty does seem to be on par with the standard setting of most Resident Evil games these days. There's not enough ammo to kill everything, but enough to pave a path for the most part. And while you'll be low on supplies often on your first playthrough, you aren't going to back yourself into a corner with your save file unless you really suck. On the first playthrough I did for this video, I didn't have my first death until I was running through the jail at the very end of the station segment as Leon. Part of this, I'm sure, was because I played through this section a couple of years ago when it came out, but I couldn't remember much, and I was still able to get by without draining all my supplies through that whole part of the game. After the police station, you move forward to the other two areas of the game and the sewers and eventually the nest where the G-Virus samples are. I'm going to be honest here, I don't really care very much for Resident Evil 2 Remake at this point, coming out of my first playthrough. Maybe it's because I'm coming straight off of Resident Evil Village and trying to slow down to the pace of an old school Resident Evil style game is hard, but gun to my head, I'd have to say it's because this game sort of falls apart after the police station just a little bit, and it's kind of strange to me as I'm typing this because on this channel so far I've been generous to games like Kane and Lynch 2, and yet I'm not blown away by this at all. That probably has something to do with the fact that I go into a game like Kane and Lynch 2 with no expectations of quality, and I go into the Resident Evil 2 Remake with very high expectations of quality. I will concede that I've gone back to games later on that I haven't liked or I've wondered what I'm thinking, and it's not outside of the realm of possibility to imagine I like this one more later on, but the odds are slim. To me, this game feels both short and padded out. My first run took me a little less than it took me to beat Resident Evil Village, and most of that was done in 2 sittings. It took me a little under 7 hours to beat Resident Evil 2 Remake, and the entire second half of the game I played in 1 sitting and just sort of breezed through it. I still died a few times and obviously had to solve some puzzles, but I found that it was easy to just knock an enemy down with a few shots to the head and run past them. Even the tyrant that terrified me early on becomes mostly an irritant later, especially during the second run and other playthroughs when you have all the doors unlocked in an area, and you can just easily turn around and take out one of the 1,000 different shortcuts to where you need to be to lose the tyrant. Plus, after you get out of the police station, the tyrant shows up like twice before the end, and in both situations he's really easy to get around. You learn pretty quick that the tyrant can be easily outdone by a shelf or a desk or an area slightly larger than a hallway, and it starts to become more annoying than scary. It definitely sounds contradictory to my earlier statements on the tyrant, but that was written while I was still at the police station on my first run, and after beating the game I realized how little danger I was actually in. This does change a bit when you go into second run, however. Going the traditional route, I did the first run as Leon and second as Claire. Second run with Claire is a little bit harder. Enemy placements have been changed, save locations have been removed, and you get to see at least a couple of different rooms. Okay, that's not necessarily fair. There's a different array of weapons with Claire. You get the grenade launcher, the 2 types of 9mm pistols, a quickfire revolver that the game leaves ammo around for through the entire game. Watching Claire unload one of those things like an old spaghetti western movie is awesome, and I appreciate that they're willing to be goofy with it. While coming out of the second run, as I am now, I feel more favorable than I was coming out of the first run, although I do have one major complaint. When you do the second run, you basically play the same game, only with a couple minor alterations. I made a point to try and keep a hold of the timeline where Claire would be on the second run, following along with the plotline of Leon's campaign. And look, I can deal with some stuff that may need to be stretched out in order to make the timelines match up when the game levels are being recycled in a game like this, but there's very little effort put in here to keep things even along the same timeline for the second run. This might seem like a minor complaint and something I forgive more with the original Resident Evil games than I do with these remakes. And while I forgive having to fight the same bosses, it wouldn't be hard to lay out the arenas so it looks like we're showing up after the other character had already been there and while still making the plot and the timeline work. Granted, the original Resident Evil remake on the GameCube had it easy for the separate character playthroughs. If you chose Jill, then Chris was in the cell and vice versa, and that's it. Resident Evil 2 Remake is in a much harder spot considering the choices of its namesake, but I feel like this part of the story could have been fixed. Either line them up so that they happen side by side, or make it so Claire and Leon never act and it's strictly an A and B scenario similar to what other Resident Evils have done. Still, after finishing the second run scenario, I am curious to see how it would feel after a hardcore run of Scenario 1 as Claire on hardcore. One moment, please.
And I don't fuck with that. I'm literally eating ass like I'm Bob.
Yep. That's definitely harder. All right, no, to be honest, I actually enjoy first scenario as Claire, and I do enjoy playing as Claire more, and honestly, I feel like I may have let myself down a little bit by playing as Leon first. I feel like the game is objectively more fun when you get a grenade launcher instead of a shotgun. Also, hardcore can feel pretty rewarding, especially when you know where everything is and you can plan your routes and saves. So yeah, I am feeling better about this now that I actually am coming out of playing it a couple more times rather than when I came out of first run. Beyond just the story campaign, there's 4 bonus modes I went through called the Ghost Survivors, and they're fine. Some quick challenge modes for fans who want more stuff to do after the main section, and that's cool. I frankly don't care enough, and that's about as far as my opinion goes. All in all, I'm glad I really finally sat down and went through this, but after 3 runs, I think it's probably not one I'm going to be picking up again to play anytime soon.
Later, Nick.